That's very kind. So good morning. I'm very sorry to be a little bit masochistic and too formalist at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning to you, but this is what Jan asked me to do, is to talk about the effect side. And of course this is a conference on pharmacology and related stuff. And Jan asked me to tell you something about the effect side. And is it fact or is it fiction? These are my conflicts of interest. Not that I get rich out of this, but as the chair of a department, you have to sign all the contracts for the entire department, so every euro goes to the department and not to me, just for completeness. So today we will talk about pharmacokinetics, and I will throw you back to your medical school. For those who don't remember what pharmacology is, in fact, pharmacology consists of two major things. That's pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. And pharmacokinetics are describing the time course of the plasma concentration during and after drug administration. The plasma, remember that word. Pharmacodynamics are time independent, and it's a time independent description of the relationship between that drug concentration at the site of the receptor, not per se at the plasma. Remember that, at the site of the receptor and the clinical drug effect. So let's start with pharmacokinetics. You all know that our body is very complex, and also to describe the time course of that plasma concentration throughout the body, it's quite complex. You can try to measure it in every organ, and then you get like a physiological based model. But also there you have to do a lot of assumptions. So what very scientific oriented people 50, 60 years ago did is they thought about just making compartments of the body and to describe the pharmacokinetics of a drug as volumes of distribution and clearances in compartments. And in fact, if you inject a bolus or a continuous infusion in a patient, you measure drug concentration, you can see there is a relationship that can be described as compartmental models. And this is, for example, a three-compartmental model. You administer the drug in the central compartment. That's what you see here. This is the drug administration. It comes in here. That compartment has a volume. The drug doesn't stay at the plasma or the central compartment, but is distributed to what we call rapidly equilibrating parts of the body and slowly equilibrating parts of the body. And it comes back, called redistribution. So you can mathematically describe what happens with the concentration in all these boxes by this kind of formulas. I will not go into the mathematical details, that's not the purpose of this lecture. So you can transfer these little microconstants of rates between what's happening between the boxes as clearances in the boxes and clearances out of the body. So if you remember this morning, that pharmacokinetic modeling can be described with compartmental models consisting of volumes of distribution and clearances. You're ready to go. So three compartmental model means three volumes of distribution and three clearances. And of course, you need to know the amount of drug. That's what's happening in the plasma and how to describe it. And of course, this is just a basic model, and you have to add covariates. Because you can see, if you look to your data, for example, if H is related to the size of volume of distribution, or weight tells you something about clearance, or vice versa. So what we do is we start, when we have data, we start by modeling these basic models, and then we look if age, weight, gender, renal function, hepatic function is related, or maturation for the units, for example, is related to one of these 6 values. And you can do that, for example, for propofol, and I told you it's masochistic for a Saturday morning. This is the new, most recently model for propofol. It's the Elevate model, which is now commercially available in most of the TCI pumps. And as you can see, this is a model that we developed at our group. And you see here, it looks very complicated, but these are just functions of aging and maturation, but it's a simple three-compartmental model. We had arterial and venous samples, So we were able to both model what happened arterial and venous, but it's still a 3-compartmental model. And it tells you something about the trajectory, the time course of your plasma concentration of the drug. So you can use this kind of models to describe the pharmacokinetics of the drug, what happens in the plasma. Now the problem is that there is a second thing that's called pharmacodynamics. And most of us are clinicians here in the room, and we all know when you inject or you start your infusion pump with propofol, but let's say you inject a bolus of propofol in a patient as fast as you can. The onset of drug effect is not instantaneous. It takes some time. So what does this mean? Is that your time course of your plasma concentration is not the same as the time course of your drug effect. There is a kind of delay. Remember, delay, very important in this talk. So, to study what's happening at the receptor, which is for propofol, not at the plasma, because otherwise you would not have a delay. What happens between that receptor concentration and the clinical effect, that's called pharmacodynamics. So again, pharmacodynamics describes the relationship between the drug concentration at the receptor and the clinical effect it produces for propofol, hypnosis. But you can also model side effects, for example, what happens with blood pressure. But we will not talk about that today. So the drug concentration at the receptor, and now I'm coming close to the title of my talk, that effect site. So the drug concentration at the receptor, if you look in the literature, you will find that sometimes it's called the site of action, or the effect site, or the effect site compartment, or the biophase. So it's not very clear what the authors sometimes mean with this. So, to come back to the title Jan gave me, tell us something about that effect site. We have to be clear what we're talking about. Are we talking about site of action, effect site compartment, biophase, and can we model that delay between that bolus given in the venous part of the blood and the site of action? Well, we have to go, for pharmacodynamic modeling, we have to go as close as possible to that receptor site. Now, of course, it would be quite unethical to take a part of the brain of your patient, of your volunteer, to model propofol. You can't do that. It has been done in small animals, but of course it's not quite realistic to do that in clinical practice. So, and we know in the world of pharmacology in general, and this article is a very nice reference to that, that for modeling drugs, and I'm talking in general, modeling drugs like oncology drug, chemotherapeutics for example, knowing the time course of the plasma concentration of your drug is not very accurate to do dosing schemes, to calculate dosing schemes, or to tell you something about the pharmacodynamics. So you want to sample as close as possible to the site of drug effect. Now we can go quite close. This is, for example, a study that we did. I think I have to go for the next slide. So this is a study we did in Groningen where we put CSF catheters, spinal catheters in volunteers for 24 hours to measure hormones in the CSF. And this was a preparation of a study for Alzheimer medication in our phase 1 unit. So you can already go very close to that site of drug effect. If your drug effect, for example, is if your receptor is located in the central nervous system, CSF sampling might be a good approximation of your concentration at the site of drug effect. So we are coming closer to that effect site. Now, if you really want to know the receptor concentration, you have to go to the lab. And this is one of my residents who worked in Doug Rain's lab in Boston and worked on the electrophysiology of etomidate analogs. And Beatrice, when she was there, she measured with patch clamp the electrovoltage changes over one cell, oocyte cells. So, and I can tell you then, your you're very close. That concentration that you measure in your cell is very close to the receptor. If you can't come so close, then of course it's easy to make a figure of the effect versus the concentration of drug at your receptor. And that's the real pharmacodynamic curve you have here. This is really the relationship between the effect and the drug concentration. If you can come so close, that's of course fantastic. Remember that still, on the onset and the offset, there is still a difference, which is strange. So there is still some delay, there is still some kind of hysteresis in the onset and offset, even if you're measuring at the receptor site. Also remember that. It's quite important and interesting to remember that. This is the real effect site. This is the real effect site concentration of a drug at the site of the receptor. Of course, that's the lab. That's one cell. If you go back to our clinical patient with propofol and the bubbles and the delay, you're far away from your receptor site. Another thing you should know is this, what is steady state concentration? The steady state concentration refers to a condition in which the concentration of a substance remains constant over time. Okay, so CSS equals the plasma concentration and equals the effect site concentration at that drug effect site. If you have that, you're already very close to reality. And then you can, as I showed you in the other side, you can do direct pharmacokinetics, drug concentration at the receptor versus the clinical effect. If you go in the log domain, you see that you got a segmental relationship. This is the classical pharmacodynamic relationship we know from our textbooks. And you can describe that pharmacodynamic relationship with 4 parameters, being Emax, gamma, EC50, and E0. And this is what we know from our textbooks, that you can, if the effect is full agonist, you go to 100% effect, partial, no effect, and the inverse agonist. Going back to our propofol, this is a study, a figure that we published in our chapter in Miller's anesthesia, coming from a German group, from Sascha Kroer. And what he did here is he injected propofol in patients. He gave an infusion, he stopped the infusion. This is the plasma concentration. And this is the BIS effect. So he measured depth of anesthesia, and you see that there is a delay between the time course of the plasma concentration and the time course of the BIS. And when you plot this and this relationship, you see that you have a hysteresis effect. There is a delay between the effect site concentration and the effect. And there is also a delay between the clinical effect and the plasma concentration. So to find out what that delay is, it's possible to fabricate an effect site compartment or an effect site concentration by doing a mathematical logistic regression or a sigmoid regression, and then you can measure the delay between the effect site and the plasma. And the only thing you have to know is what is that delay factor. If you know that, you can put it into your combined PK/PD model. This is how we do it with loop hysteresis, and then you can add to that 3-compartmental model, you can add a effect site. And that effect site is a representation of what happens at the site of drug effect. The only thing you have to know is, of course, these 4 components of your drug effect and the delay between your plasma concentration and your effect site concentration. And this is why you need that Ke0. So in fact, if you have the 5 components, E0, Emax, the slope of your curve, and your EC50, plus the Ke0, you have everything you need mathematically to make a combined PK/PD model. This was, in fact, invented by the group of Lou Scheiner at UCSF end of the 70s and was first applied to muscle relaxants. This is a complete pharmacokinetic dynamic model for a drug where the site of action is not the plasma. Muscle relaxants are having their action out of the plasma. There is a delay between the time course of the plasma concentration and the onset of your drug effect. That delay can be modeled by the effect site compartment. We did that for propofol. This is the entire Eleveld model. This is the pharmacokinetic part, and this is the pharmacodynamic part. EC50, K0, the effect, gamma, and your delay. So with that, you can mathematically describe the entire dose-response relation from what is in your syringe, going through the blood, traveling to the receptor, and giving you the clinical effect. You have all the components in hand. And this is what we call the concentration at the effect site in the effect site compartment. So this is, to answer Jan's question, what is the effect site? That's, for me, as a pharmacometrician, is the effect site and the effect site concentration. So the effect site model, or the effect site concentration, captures the delay between the plasma drug concentration and the observed pharmacodynamic effect. It introduces a theoretical effect site compartment to tell you something about the delay in your entire dose-response curve. The drug concentration in the effect compartment is used to drive a pharmacodynamic response. I know. So it's appropriate to use this when you want to model the delay in your dose-response relationship. It's not the same as an indirect PK/PD model, which is in the world of pharmacology something entirely different. So if you read an article about hysteresis, effect site concentration, be sure in which context this is used. If we use it in the context as clinicians in TCI pumps, if you dial in your effect site concentration, this is the effect site concentration and the effect site model in this context of pharmacokinetic hysteresis. Now, watch out, because I showed you already, even in Beatrice's patch clamp example, that even if you measure at the cellular level, there is still a hysteresis. This is strange, because you're measuring at the receptor site, which means that you should have an onset and an offset curve, which is exactly the same. And it isn't. So, effect site equilibration can tell you something about the time delay. But there is more. It does not imply that that hysteresis, because it still existed in the batch clamp examples of Beatrice studies in Boston, that it's solely attributed to the kinetics of the drug equilibration. There is something happening at the cellular level. This is another lecture, but I just wanted to tell you that there is a fascinating world behind the world of that effect site compartment. And I refer you to studies of Alex Sprauk and Max Kelt group, who are working on that neuronal dynamics. Why, for example, in clinical practice, even with the best model of propofol we're using in our TCI pumps, that our patient is falling asleep and waking up at a different effect site concentration. This means that even if we model that effect site compartment as good as we can, that there is still something behind that level that is on a neuronal dynamic level. Therefore, you have to dive very deep into the cellular and the EEG world, as what Alex and Max did in their studies. And when your patient is, because these are clinical studies, just at the phase of awake and sleep, the background noise will trigger noise in your neural dynamics. And this is not captured by what we do in effect site modeling as pharmacometricians. Therefore, you need other things. So, to answer Jan's question, is the effect site fact or fiction? Well, it depends. The effect site is certainly a fact when you use it to model the time delay between the dose and the response, but it might be not the entire truth, and you might need more than only what we do in pharmacokinetic modeling. Thank you very much.